Hi, everyone. Today we're joined by Professor Dohra Ahmad. She wrote a great book called The Penguin Book of Migration Literature. Now, she didn't write it. She has to clarify that. She's the editor, and she put together great stories about the migration experience. So I wanted to talk with her. I got my copy right here as well, and to go into what her thought process was about it, what she took away from it, because we're all immigration lawyers. We deal with one aspect of it, but what's interesting, I think, other than starting off with what your background, your introduction says a lot about it being about migration, which is immigration with an I and emigration with an E as well. But Dora, please go ahead. Let me know about your background. Everyone know about your background and start discussing.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks so much. So a couple of different things to address right there. In terms of where I'm coming from when I put the book together, I'm a professor at St. John's University in Queens, New York, which is either the most diverse or somewhere in the top three. We're always throwing these statistics around, but it's one of the most diverse counties in the United States. It's just got absolutely everybody. And my school is a historically immigrant serving institution. It was founded in the late 19th century to serve the kids of Catholic immigrants, at that time mostly Irish and Italian. But now we've really got everybody. So we've got Orthodox Jews and Muslims and plenty of Catholics and secular folks. And it's not exclusively kids from immigrant families, but really a large number of kids who trace their roots, their pretty recent roots, to all over the world. So lots of students from South Asia, West Africa, the West Indies, East Asia, really all over the place. So I was hired at St. John's in 2004, and I was the first person in the English department who was focusing on an area other than British or US literature. I was hired to teach post colonial literature, which means literature of the formerly colonized world. So you could say that the United States is post colonial as well, since it was a former British colony, but we're talking more about the countries that gained independence in the 20th century. So a lot of the same places where my students' families came from: Pakistan, Bangladesh, Jamaica, Trinidad, Nigeria, South Africa, Haiti, etc. So I had a really gratifying experience of having a chance to put together classes where my students felt like they saw themselves and their stories and their families' stories reflected. And I also have a really great English department. It's a great administrative structure where if we get an idea for a class into our heads, then we just get a chance to go ahead and teach it. So we're encouraged to invent new classes all the time. So I was hired to teach post-colonial literature, but every couple of years I kept adding on new things. And at some point I thought, wouldn't it be fun to teach a comparative migration literature class? So not only looking at literature of immigration to the United States, but also immigration to Canada, Australia, France, Germany, all these places where so many people are going and coming from. So I put that together. I taught it for the first time, I think, in 2014. And we just had a really fun, positive, kind of uplifting experience where students read all of these different texts and they got a chance to find out that their experience, for example, growing up as a kid with immigrant parents in a place like Queens, was actually pretty similar to the main characters in something like Zadie Smith's novel White Teeth, where the characters are kids whose parents came from either Bangladesh or Jamaica who are growing up in the northwest area of London, which is also a heavily immigrant area. So they had read a lot of US lit, they'd read a lot of their, Huckleberry Finn and To Catch a Mockingbird and all of that. And getting into a class where they could both see their family's experience reflected and then also see that something similar was happening in a different part of the world, that was really fun and exciting. Um, I have a previous literary anthology that also came out of a class. It's called Rotten English, a literary anthology, and it's a collection of literature in non-standard English. So I already had had an experience of taking a class and converting it into an anthology. So after I taught the class in 2014, well, the 2016 election happened and the climate not necessarily all the laws changed, but it felt like the climate changed in terms of how people were thinking about migration and immigrants, in terms of the rhetoric that was coming down, in terms of some of the kind of divisive language that was being used. Um, so at that time, I met the editor of Penguin Classics, who's really a visionary editor who's been reinventing the meaning of what it is to be a literary classic. And I talked to her about possibly putting this book together, which would bring together all of these different literary sources
Mhm.
about migration. And she loved the idea because we were in a more combative time. We were in a time where, sadly, it suddenly felt politically necessary to prove the humanity of migrants and to say that these are people with stories and backgrounds and histories, and no, they're not criminals and rapists, and they're not coming here to suck off Social Security and social services, and to take other people's jobs, but they're here to make a better life for themselves and their families. So these are the kind of stories that you see in the poetry, the short stories, the memoirs, etc., that I was already teaching in my class. So we felt together like this was the right time for this kind of collection. As far as the name, I think so. One of the things that I wanted to do with this collection that was different from other stuff I'd seen was to make it international, and it is the first anthology of literature from around the world about migration. But the second thing that I saw with a lot of both college classes and collections of literature, literary anthologies, was that they were looking at immigration with an I. And as you described, of course, you all are very well versed in these distinctions. The difference between someone who's an immigrant and someone who's an emigrant is a difference of perspective, whether you're situated in the country that somebody's leaving or the country that somebody is coming to. And the reason that I wanted to go with migration literature instead of immigrant literature is that I wanted to emphasize both where people were coming from as well as where they were going. And I didn't want to say only this is this smooth trajectory. People come from somewhere to somewhere, become American, become British, become Canadian, whatever it is. They may always feel like they're Kenyan in their heart. They may always feel like they're Bangladeshi in their heart, whatever it is. Um, and I think it's very interesting as well that these definitions are useful, but they're also somewhat limited. So the same person who would be considered an emigrant in India would be considered an immigrant in the United Arab Emirates, but it's the same exact person. So that's why I wanted to kind of cut off that distinction and just talk about migration. Because there's also returns. There's people who go back in the summer. There are remittances sent back. There's online activity. There's political organizing. There are all these different kind of lines of influence. And I felt like calling it Book of Migration Literature would cover those lines and connections and back and forths a little bit more than the kind of teleological idea of immigrant literature.
You know,
So I hope that
if I have
answers some
one,
of those questions.
if I have one critique, the part about returns is only one book. I wish that one had. I was really looking forward to more that aspect of that angle.
Honestly, there's actually not that much because I think a lot of the immigrant literature that we read is kind of teleological. And that might have something to do with the time period. So if you're looking at 19th century literature about people fleeing Russia and coming to New York City, a lot of those were one-way tickets and
Yeah.
were people who didn't come back. So it's really just in the last 10 or 15 years or so that there are more and more stories of returns.
Mm-hmm.
So something like, for example, the quote that I always go back to from The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, Junot Diaz says, every summer the diaspora engine slaps into reverse. So that idea that even if you're in one place, you're always going to be thinking about going back, or you might go back, or you might send family members back, you might send just the kids back. That's more recent. So that's more, I think, a function of when migration became more air-based as opposed to sea-based. It's something that voluntary migrants are able to do more than involuntary migrants. So there just wasn't that much out there. But the flip side is the one story that I did put in that section. So John is referring to, the book is organized into 3 sections. The first is called Departures.
Mhm.
and it's about the process of leaving a country. The second is called Arrivals, and it's about what happens to people when they get to a new place. The third is called Generations, and it's about the kids of immigrants. And then I felt like that all tells too much of a single directional story. So I stuck in this extra section called Returns that kind of encapsulates the idea that people might go back, even if it's emotional only, even if it's not physical, that people will always be thinking to some degree about the place where they came from. So as John is describing, there's only one short story in that return section, but it does so much. So the short story is called A Conversation, and it takes the form of a conversation between an older husband and wife who have come from Egypt to the US. And they're always having this debate. And I think this is something that's familiar in so many immigrant families. Should we stay or should we go? Who wants to stay? Who wants to go? What would be the advantages of going back? What is our money worth? Who do we miss? What landscape do we miss? Maybe it's better here. So I felt like that short story did so much work for me that in some way it's all that
Yeah.
that the anthology needed. And then I do have more recommendations. So in the intro I talk about some other books that tell similar stories about returns. So
So
if you're interested, there are more.
yeah, definitely. At a practice standpoint, the group of people I've seen the most who want to go back home eventually are the Indian community,
Mm.
especially northern India. They're just like they want to go back, and they're even though they're successful here and all that kind of stuff. So that's interesting. Now, with my background, I study a lot of political science and history. The book does a great job of making people less two-dimensional. I mean, if someone takes the time to read this, they're probably more open-minded anyways. But it takes out of that two-dimensional aspect you talked about, someone just coming for benefits or something like that. These are people who either want to bring something or they're running away from some complicated stuff. So, and that's to say it lightly, to say complicated. I mean, to talk about the history of the international slave trade, which is not just U.S. based immigration or even the triangle with Great Britain, but it's all over the place. And seeing like families, kids are literally washed over so they don't get kidnapped in Africa, taken away, and brothers and sisters seeing each other. It's a heart wrenching story, but it's probably millions of people went through that historically and still go through that today. So it's really fascinating to see that forced migration. Not everyone's trying to move. People like where they live. There was another story where they lived in a bad situation, but they ended with, no matter how cramped and hard the living situation was, it was still an Eden to them, a safe enclosure. So it's not a lot of times. I mean, even people who are coming here willingly are still not willingly coming here. No one wants to get up and leave. It's a hard process to immigrate, even with air travel, even with all that kind of stuff. So the difficulty of that process is really exposed there. It was very interesting. And then,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, and I'll just respond to that really quickly. So that kind of speaks to a couple of the other things that I wanted to make sure to do with the collection. So one thing that's different about it is that it's international. Another thing that's different about it is that the focus is migration, not immigration. And a third piece that was really important to me was to include um, a broad historical span going all the way back to the 17th century, to the slave trade, um, and put all of those types of migration within the same framework. So to say it's not just a matter of black and white, it's not a matter of forced versus voluntary, there's a whole spectrum where there's a gray area in the middle where people have somewhat of a choice, or they may technically on paper have a choice, but it's not really much of a choice. It's a choice to live or to die. And then, as you said, there's a whole other end of the spectrum, which is forced migration, trafficking situations, indentureship, slavery. So I felt like that was an important part of the story as well. The stories of voluntary migration are often highlighted, but the stories of forced migration are really important as well.
that kind of segues. One of my favorite stories was the story about these Japanese women who are coming to the United States to get married. And, there's probably one person narrating it, but each of those women that are coming have different stories. So one might be forced, might be escaping, one might be willingly coming, told a story that's going to be great. Some people fall in love on the ship. Some people even, commit suicide because they're, and it just shows the different things going on, all different kind of people in that cultural period of their time. It's a fascinating window to open up. And just one thing that's always going to stay with me is this one line. We talked about this before, but I'm not sure if this is still the case, but this woman said, I've heard in America the opposite of white is black, whereas like in Japan, opposite of white is red. And that one line really stuck with me. It shows like, you know, people can be really different. And something growing up in America is so basic as opposite of white is black, black and white. That's that. In that culture at that time, maybe even now, opposite is red was really fascinating to show like the brain, culture and images could be completely different. Even though it seems insignificant, maybe I feel there's a huge significance to that shift.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great example. And for all of you as lawyers, I'm sure you're in so many situations where you have to really get into somebody else's perspective and understand how they're experiencing something, because when they give you all of the details and they give you the narrative, you need to see that from their point of view. So yeah, that idea of that coming here means an entire shift in a way of looking at the world, a shift in culture, is really powerful. So the story that John is talking about, it's in here as a freestanding short story called Come Japanese. But it's also the first chapter in a novel called The Buddha in the Attic, which is a really beautiful historical novel that starts with the quote unquote picture brides coming from Japan to agrarian California to come and connect with men who were already, Japanese men who were already working farms in California in around the 1920s to 1930s. And the novel, which isn't in the anthology, goes all the way through to the internment period. So that's
Oh,
another type of internal migration.
yeah.
And the thing that John was referring to, one of the things that's really super interesting about the selection is that it's not narrated by a single I, it's narrated by the word we. So it's a collective story that's being told. It's all of this, it's a very complex, multi-layered experience where different women who are coming over on the ship from Japan to California come from different classes. Some come from the city, different social classes, that is. Some come from the city, some come from the country, some are educated and from elite situations, and some have been thrown out of their homes. So it's a really interesting kind of we, and I think it applies to the whole anthology where there is a sense of first person plural. We have this experience, but at the same time, you can slice up that first person plural into so many different I's. So the I could be really different depending on your social class, your educational background, your sexuality, your gender identity, all of these different things. And we see that in that short story, Come Japanese, that we, migrants are a we, but migrants are also a set of thousands,
Yeah.
millions of different I's, and everyone's story is a little bit different.
Definitely. And one of the things that other immigration lawyers especially will see is one book, they're talking about coming to California. There's a line that says people there sweep money off the streets. And that's a false perspective. A lot of my clients have. And that's why I sit them down really the first day and say, they're not going to hand you a gold bar. This isn't the Baywatch TV show. You can't, they're just not like, you know, that situation with women, all that. You have to work in America, and it's a struggle, really. It's a treadmill that keeps getting faster and faster unless you're one of the elites. There's no siestas where you take a nap in the middle of the day. There's no slowness, and like there's a lot of foreign countries. It's a job to be an American. It's a never-ending job. So that was interesting. I saw that line. It comes up a lot in my line of work.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a theme throughout in the departures section. One thing that comes up a lot is the mythologies of these, the pull countries or the destination countries, that the streets are paved with gold, that there's going to be better opportunity. And whether it's Canada or the UK or England, we see it. For example, there's a an excerpt from a novel called Strawberry Fields, which is about Ukrainian strawberry pickers in England. And it's that exact same mythology of this is what England is going to be. It's going to welcome me with open arms, and I'm going to have everything that I was hoping for. And then in the second section of the anthology, Arrivals, that's when that mythology gets shattered. So we see that, for example, somebody might move from a country where they were in a racial majority. They might move from a place like Trinidad or Jamaica, where the majority of people were of African descent, and they might come and encounter anti-Black racism in the United States or in Canada or in England, on a harsher and more systemic level than they had ever known it before. Or it might be somebody who's moving from a Muslim country and encountering rampant Islamophobia for the first time. And then I think for a lot of migrants, there's that decision of whether to keep perpetuating the mythology. So sometimes people get here, they find it disappointing, they find it difficult, they find it not everything that they were hoping for, but they still keep giving those optimistic stories to people back home.
Yeah.
So we actually see that, and there's a poem called um, the Toilet Attendant Writes Home by David Dabydeen, who's a Guyanese writer, about a guy who has migrated to England, and he's writing a letter back to his family and friends in Guyana, and he's telling a story of success, but you can kind of read through the lines and understand that it's not everything he was hoping it would be.
Yeah.
So you see the host country perpetuates those mythologies, but sometimes migrants themselves keep up those mythologies.
Definitely. And you know, there was a line in one of the stories, and we all know, you know, U.S. racism against African Americans is stiff as hard, but they mentioned in the U.K. it's not as direct, but it's a very charming way they do their racism. And I was actually seeing this one clip of a video where someone was talking. They said the UK, they had slavery, but at least in America, when they enslaved people, they would live right next to them. In the UK, they would just ship it from Africa, take them to islands, and they keep that distance. So it always looked like their hands were clean of it all. So
Right.
this process is really fascinating. You know, I'm gonna end the conversation, the interview, pretty soon. But I had one question for me as a professor. This is it's hard to create courses out of a thin air. How to, how is I teach as well, and like my teaching is, I already know it's a law, this and that. I'm a law professor, but how do you create a? I mean, how much work is involved to create a thing like this? Because there'll be professors watching as well, be interested.
I mean, honestly, for me, it's the most fun part of my job. So I'm not, in my mind, I don't have the mind of a deep researcher. I don't go deep into an area, I go broad and out, and I love reading widely in a new topic area. So the first anthology, the one that I wrote earlier, 2007, I just got recommendations from people and started reading everything I could in non-standard English.
Mhm.
And then for this one, just everybody's so passionate about the topic, so I could get great recommendations from any bookstore owner, any friend on social media, just doing a lot of Googling. So just really reading, it was so gratifying and so fun. I have wonderful grad students. I have PhD students at St. John's who work in this area and who had fantastic suggestions. A lot of stuff that I couldn't fit in the anthology, including not only because of size, but because of format. So I got great suggestions for movies, TV shows, comedy, websites. So a lot of that is in a suggestions for further reading section in the book. Um, so yeah, it's daunting, it's big, but it's just so much fun. It's a lot of digging. That's what I use a lot of my summers for.
Yeah.
So this year, I have a lot of students who are interested in young adult literature, so I'll probably teach a class coming up on the history of young adult literature, and I'm really looking forward to just reading widely in that.
If you're a fellow bookworm, I guess it makes it easy. It's just it's more fun, more reading. Now, this is a college level course or a graduate level course that was the basis of this book?
The migration class was undergrad, college level.
And how
Yeah.
would the final be? Is it how is the final exam for it, or how they grade
I
grader?
don't I don't do exams because the topics that I teach don't have a specific body of material that it makes sense to ask students to master. I think it's more about exploring and asking questions. So actually, that's a great question because we did such a fun final project. Some of my students have a kind of creative element, and some of them are more analytical. So I gave students the option of, okay, here are all the things that we read from, for example, September to November. Now we're going to take a month and you're going to go out and discover some more migration literature, and you're going to report back to the rest of the class. What was this other piece that you also read that could have fit in? What else does it bring? So even the piece that you liked, Come Japanese, I found that because a student read it and recommended it to
Wow.
me and brought it into the end of the class. And then for the students who came from more creative side, I gave them the option of writing a new migration narrative. So they could go interview a friend, interview a family member, they could do historical research, and then they had to choose a genre, whether it was going to be a poetry cycle or a short story or something in the form of letters or diaries. and they would write and workshop and show it to the rest of the class and get feedback from the class. So I saw a lot of really fantastic stuff, and that was kind of the culminating final project that I evaluated them on. But I learned so much from it, and it was so enjoyable.
Thank
So
you so
that's
much.
instead of a final exam.
Thank you. And one of my I did okay, but English and just literature was one of the best courses I took in college. I think that prepared me for life the most. It forced me. I had great professors, and it forced me to, when you write stuff, think things through. And now when I look back at what I've written, I wish I had proofread stuff better or read it a second or third time, make it better. Do you usually deal with that, where people just have like the initial draft is what they turn in? Because I'll read it now, I'm like, I could have made it so much better if I just wasn't lazy and I read it a second time or third time just to make it better.
Yeah, we're really into revision. So I think you can always make your writing a little bit better. And that's the way that we do it in the class is they workshop it. So whether it's the analytical or the creative, everybody else reads it and gives comments like, oh, I didn't really understand what was going on here. Can you make this more clear?
Well, that's
So
awesome.
yeah, it's a work in progress. And even for me with the introduction, I had my husband read it. I had a lot of friends read it and just make sure, because this was all new to me. Like you all know immigration law inside and out, and I had to learn a lot of the history and the political background. So I sent it out to a bunch of people just to make sure that I wasn't off mark.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm glad we were able to connect.
Uh,
It was a fantastic book. I have a link to Amazon link as well. If someone wants to contact you, what's the best way to do that? Or, and if you have
uh,
social media and stuff, let me know.
yeah, I have a website, migrationliterature.weebly.com, and it's got all the suggestions for further reading that I keep adding to like every week. It's got a bunch of web-based resources. It's got discussion questions. It's got a list of upcoming events, most of which had to get canceled and are going to get rescheduled.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, I could send you that. And if you want to link to that too, that'd be
Yeah,
great.
I'll grab the link and I'll put it. Thank you so much, Dora, for coming on the show. I
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
Have a great
My
day.
pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me. Bye bye.
Bye bye.